Hi, my name is Chelsea Batavia. I did my graduate work at Oregon State University and until quite recently worked there as a postdoc as well. My research focus is on ethics in environmental conservation and management, and today I'd like to talk with you about a topic I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about, and that's trophy hunting. I'll start with this slide, which presents an analytical framework you can use to think through ethical issues in conservation. In this case, trophy hunting, but the framework is applicable in many other contexts as well, I would say. So let's talk through this for a minute. When you're trying to evaluate trophy hunting through an ethical lens, there are a couple major axes of considerations you should be attending to. The first is ethical theory, sometimes also called normative theory. In ethics, theories articulate an understanding of what constitutes appropriate conduct, and also explain how or why that conduct is appropriate. Classically, ethical theory is broken into three major branches, shown in the three boxes in the middle of the diagram: consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics. Very briefly, consequentialism posits that the appropriateness or rightness of an act depends on the outcomes it produces. So, on a consequentialist view, an act is right when it brings about the best possible outcomes. Deontology posits that the appropriateness of an act is a feature of the act itself. According to deontological theories, an act is right when it upholds certain defined ethical rules, principles, or rights. And then virtue theory, or virtue ethics, posits that the appropriateness of an act depends on both the outcomes and the act itself, as unified in the character of the person committing the act. So, through a virtue lens, an act is right when it exemplifies virtuous character. Those were all pretty simplified explanations of the three major ethical theories, but in the interest of keeping this succinct, I'm not going to go into any more detail here. Instead, I'm going to shift gears and talk about the second axis of ethical consideration, which is moral patience, depicted here in the colored ovals. When we talk about moral patience, we're talking about those entities who are considered proper targets of direct moral concern. In plain language, these are the entities who count in a moral sense. Now, in a conservation context, there are a few broad categories of moral patience we may need to pay attention to. One of those categories is humans. The thing about humans is that they're a little tricky because they're both moral patients, so they count, and they're proper targets of moral concern. But they're also moral agents, meaning they have moral responsibility. In other words, as humans, we hold ourselves accountable for ethical conduct, whereas usually other types of beings are not expected to adhere to human ethical norms. Don't worry too much about that for the purposes of this presentation. I just wanted to make sure you know it is possible to be both a moral patient, so someone who receives moral concern, and a moral agent, so someone who extends and acts upon moral concern. The other two categories of moral patients are individual non-human beings, like this male lion in the bright green oval, and ecological collectives, like populations, species, or ecosystems. Finer distinctions are possible too. For example, some philosophers would distinguish between sentient and non-sentient individual beings, or between endangered and common species. But we'll leave it at a pretty coarse grain for now. Putting all this together, the idea behind this analytical framework is that whenever you hear someone express an opinion or a policy preference about trophy hunting, if you look at those opinions more carefully, you'll find they're invoking certain ethical theories and emphasizing certain moral patience. And so as ethical analysts, what we want to know is if they are justified in invoking those theories and prioritizing those moral patience and reaching appropriate conclusions. Let's look at this more carefully. For the next several slides, I'm going to use a specific method, sometimes used in conservation ethics, called argument analysis. The basic idea of argument analysis is that we break down proposals for environmental management or conservation into formal arguments, meaning premises and conclusions. You'll see plenty of examples in a minute. Now, when we've taught this in class previously, we coach students to follow a systematic process where they start by formulating a question like, for example, should we trophy hunt members of some wildlife population, call it X, in some location, call it Y? From there, students catalog all the reasons why people would say we should or should not trophy hunt X and Y. So here are just a few examples listed in this table. To conduct an analysis, then, the objective would be to build each of these reasons out into a formal argument, one at a time, in order to understand and evaluate the various premises underpinning the conclusion. Let's do an example. We're going to take a look at the argument that we should trophy hunt X in Y because it provides funds for conservation. So here's how this argument might look written out. So P1, that's premise 1, there are threatened species in Y, and P2, we ought to promote the recovery of threatened species. And so our first conclusion is therefore we ought to promote the recovery of threatened species that are in Y. Third premise, to promote the recovery of threatened species in Y, we need sufficient funds. And P4, the only way to generate sufficient funds is to implement a program to trophy hunt X in Y, and therefore our final conclusion is that we ought to implement a program to trophy hunt X in Y. I'll point out first that there are both ethical premises like P2, as well as empirical or descriptive premises like P4. Argument analysis can be used to reveal and evaluate both types. We're mostly focused on ethics at the moment, so for now I want to specifically draw your attention to P2. That's the ethical or normative claim this argument hinges on. Now let's look at an argument from the other side of the table. So we'll look at the reason, we'll build out the reason that we should not that we should not trophy hunt X and Y because it involves killing animals. And here's how this argument might look spelled out. So P1, X are living organisms, and P2, we ought to respect the vital interests of living organisms, leading to our first conclusion that we ought to respect the vital interests of X. Third premise, that implementing a program to trophy hunt X and Y disrespects their vital interests, and therefore our final conclusion is that we ought not implement a program to trophy hunt X and Y. And again, I'll draw your attention to premise P2, which is the ethical crux of the argument. So now looking at these side by side, you can see we have two different management recommendations, the conclusions, predicated on two different ethical claims, our P2s. The question is, what do we do about this? Well, the tactic I've seen most is to then scale up one level and make an argument that one of these two ethical premises somehow overrides the other. Formally, the argument could look something like this. So here you can see I've just lifted those two ethical premises into a new argument, but from there we go to P3. We cannot promote the recovery of threatened species and respect the vital interests of living organisms, meaning at once. We can't do both of those at once. P4, where moral requirements conflict, where moral requirements refer to the stipulations made in P1 and P2. The more important requirement overrides the less important requirement. P5, promoting the recovery of threatened species is more important than respecting the vital interests of living organisms, and therefore we conclude that the moral requirement to promote the recovery of threatened species overrides the moral requirement to respect the vital interests of living organisms. So according to this argument, the higher ethical requirement is to promote species recovery. It's basically a statement of priorities. And then the implication, which I did not write out, but the implication of this argument would be that because species recovery overrides respect for individuals, it's appropriate to implement our trophy hunting program. From my reading of the scientific literature, I would say this is the argument that has been advanced most commonly by conservation scientists. So here are just a couple examples, and there are also a few popular media pieces in outlets like National Geographic and Smithsonian Magazine that have also sort of flirted with this perspective. Situating the argument in our analytical framework, we can say it's a consequentialist position, so a good outcome, in this case species recovery, is believed to justify the act of trophy hunting. So those benefits outweigh the violation of individual dignity, the disrespecting of the individual. And then the moral patients of primary concern are ecological collectives, in this case, species or populations. This is a prominent line of argumentation, but not the only one. Another line of argument that we've seen, less in academic literature than in popular media circles, might go something like this. So we're starting with the same two premises, but then, starting with the same four premises, but then our P5 is that basically the converse of what we saw before. The moral requirement to respect the vital interests of living organisms is more important than the moral requirement to promote the recovery of threatened species. And therefore, our conclusion here is that the moral requirement to respect the vital interests of living organisms overrides the moral requirement to promote the recovery of threatened species. So now the argument claims that respecting the individual is the higher value, and so that's the overriding moral requirement. And again, the argument carries an implication, which is that we should not implement trophy hunting of X in Y. Again, coming back to our analytical framework, generally this argument is associated with a deontological perspective, which emphasizes the duty to respect individual life, and the priority is placed on the individual as his moral patient. So this is the way the debate has played out, mostly, with people making their different arguments and claiming that certain values outweigh others. Species recovery is more important than respecting individuals, for example. So the right thing to do is to use trophy hunting. Or on the other side, respect for individuals is a sacred value. So the right thing to do is to discontinue trophy hunting. The thing is, though, outside of the practical decision space where we have to decide one way or another, implement trophy hunting or don't, removing ourselves from that practical context for a second, we can realize that these different value claims about species recovery and respect for individuals, those aren't locked in a zero-sum game. If you think about it, there's really no indisputable way to judge that one of these ethical values is more important than the other. And all practical decision pressures aside, we don't really have a reason to think one has to override the other. So the way I see it, we're actually dealing with one great big argument. Sorry, I know this is a lot of text. This is just our first two arguments, the first ones that I showed you mashed together. The thing is, this creates a problem that we don't have when we deal with two separate arguments, which is that now we have two contradictory conclusions in one argument. We ought to implement trophy hunting and we ought not implement trophy hunting. This contradiction, a logical contradiction, indicates the existence of what philosophers call a moral dilemma. So that's a case where we recognize we have multiple moral requirements, but we can't fulfill all of them at once. I'm going to try to put this in visual terms. So imagine what I'm going to call moral space. So where moral space is populated by all the moral requirements we acknowledge in some situation. Here O means ought. So in this figure, we ought to do A, we ought to do B, and we ought to do C. Now ideally, we would be able to act in a way that fulfills all three of these moral requirements, something like this. This is what we would call a true or wholly right action. But then, say we recognize some constraints such that we can't fulfill all of these obligations or requirements at once. So there's some logistical issue that prevents us from doing B and C at the same time. So now we have a dilemma. Under these conditions, we may decide the best thing to do overall is act in a way that fulfills our requirements to do A and C. So something like this. And maybe that's because if forced, we can make the case that C represents an altogether more important value than B. That's a defensible decision. Here's the thing though, even though we may make a sound defensible decision, the best we can under the circumstances, we're still implicated in some amount of moral wrongdoing because we have not upheld our obligation or requirement to do B. And that's because this moral requirement here, this ought to do B, it hasn't disappeared. In this situation, even the best decision we could make has implicated us in a partial moral failure. And that partial moral failure is what moral philosophers call a moral residue. I'm guessing some of you are scientifically minded, so I'll dwell on this metaphor for a minute because I don't think the semantic similarity between moral residue and statistical residuals is entirely insignificant. So a statistical residual or residue represents the difference between the line or curve that best fits the data overall and any one data point. It's pretty much the same idea encapsulated in moral residue. So moral residue is the lapse that occurs when the best decision an agent can make, all things considered, still fails to fulfill some moral requirement. It's the discrepancy between a defensible decision and a wholly right action. But even that explanation is still very dry and abstract. Really, I think the easiest and probably most accurate way to explain moral residue is like this. This lion's body is a moral residue. Now, maybe we've become accustomed to images like this, but really there's something intuitively and viscerally disturbing about this, especially when we remember that this lion was killed at least on the surface of things, in the service of conservation. So even if you think that's a worthy cause that can justify the death and desecration of this animal, that doesn't mean it's entirely right. The other disturbing part of this photograph, of course, is the couple kissing over the carcass. And this brings me to what I think is the most important point about moral residue, which is that at its core, residue is understood as an emotional response. Philosophers use different words for that to precisely explain what that response is. So guilt, remorse, regret, distress, those are all suggestions. I think probably the exact nature of the response depends on the specific circumstances. But the word that I and my co-authors on this paper have recommended for generic is grief. That feeling of grief should reflect the feeling that even though you did the best you could, you still did something wrong. And here's the really important point. When we make a decision that implicates us in some measure of moral wrongdoing, so a good decision that leaves a residue, we shouldn't walk away feeling smug or self-righteous. The appropriate response is not to be callous and defensive, insisting we've got it right while others have it wrong. And we certainly shouldn't be smooching and celebrating over the body of the victims. No. The appropriate response to moral residue is grief. If you're going to defend this practice of trophy hunting because you believe it's essential to conservation, that opinion should be tempered with a due measure of solemnity. Not because your melancholic disposition is going to do anything or make the world better, but because sometimes grief is just the right feeling to feel. So bringing this back to trophy hunting debates, I guess the idea I'd like to leave you with is that whenever you hear one side or another claiming the moral high ground, I hope you'll cast a critical eye on that posture. Trophy hunting is ethically complex territory, and unfortunately, I'm not sure there's any way to navigate it right now without continuing to accrue moral residue. Over the long term, my feeling is that we need to work for systemic change so that wildlife conservation can be funded without sacrificing individual animals, and also support and empower the humans who live in proximity with wildlife. And this brings me to a point you heard or will hear from Ariane in her presentation, which I'd like to echo. Over the long term, some philosophers have said that the grief of residue may motivate us to push for the larger structural changes that are arguably needed to make sure we don't get ourselves into dilemmas like this in the future. To me, that means we should be taking a long, hard look at empirical premises like these, and rather than just accepting them or assuming them as givens, instead work to explore unconventional or creative alternatives. But as we work toward that future, my feeling is that conservationists are going to need to get more comfortable with discomfort, both in and beyond the trophy hunting sphere. If there's one point I could leave you with today, it's that if or when you're dealing with ethically ambiguous conservation issues, I challenge you to resist the temptation to think in binary terms of right and wrong. The world is alive with moral significance, and as conservationists and really just as human beings, it's our responsibility to open our eyes to that. Insisting we're in the right while turning a blind eye to the victims of our actions may feel like a coping mechanism that eases the sting of the world and the choices we're forced to make, but I would argue it's a slim comfort that comes at the cost of our integrity. I will end there. Thank you so much for your time. If you want to read more, here are a couple citations for you. Take care.